Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. So China built nearly a terawatt of new clean energy capacity in a single year. That's like 300 large nuclear plants just popping up. It's an industrial surge, really unlike anything we've ever seen. But, here's a question we really need to tackle today. Does this massive effort just make the world greener faster? Or is it actually fundamentally redefining global power? Who controls the energy future now?
That's exactly what we're digging to. We want to go beyond just the astonishing data on China's clean energy push. We need a critical interpretation here, not just the sheer numbers, but what does all this building actually mean for markets, for energy security, for, industrial leadership globally? And crucially, we also need to look closely at the structural challenges, the nuances that kind of complicate this whole story, because, the transition isn't over, not by a long shot.
Right, let's start with the scale then, because the numbers themselves are, frankly, mind-boggling. If you look at the end of 2024, China had installed something like 887 gigawatts of solar capacity. Just to give you a sense of that, that's nearly double the combined solar capacity of the entire EU and the United States put together.
And it's not slowing down. Last year alone, they added around 277 gigawatts of new PV capacity. That's a huge jump, something like 45% year on year. There's a great analogy, actually, to help picture the industrial effort here. Think about steel. The 22 million tons of steel they used for wind and solar last year, that's enough to build a new Golden Gate Bridge every single working day.
Wow, a Golden Gate Bridge a day.
Yeah, so it really highlights that this isn't just, an energy story. It's an enormous industrial machine story.
It is. And when you see numbers like that, it immediately signals a really fundamental shift, doesn't it, in how we even define global power. For decades, it was, military reach, controlling oil choke points, maybe the size of your currency reserves. But the 21st century measure, it seems to be shifting towards technological and, economic superpower in clean electricity.
Precisely. And you see this shift in the output figures, too, not just capacity. China generated 1,826 terawatt hours from wind and solar last year. To give you some context, that's 5 times the energy locked up in its entire nuclear arsenal.
5 times?
Yeah. But maybe the most telling number is financial. China now earns more money exporting green tech solar panels, wind turbines, EVs, than the U.S. earns from exporting all its fossil fuels.
That's huge.
It is. That's the clearest sign, really, of where global economic leverage is moving. And it's also why China, just through sheer scale of deployment, has already met or even gone past most of its Paris Agreement targets years ahead of schedule.
Okay, so that pivot from oil barrels to solar modules as the source of economic leverage, that's really the core of it. Let's get into the engine behind this, the cost. How does China make this stuff so affordable? It sounds like a kind of self-reinforcing cycle.
It absolutely is. China generates about 1/3 of all the electricity used globally. That creates this enormous built-in domestic market. That huge demand then fuels hyperscale manufacturing, which in turn drives down the cost of innovation, the cost of production.
Yeah.
And that creates this global cost advantage that, frankly, is almost impossible for others to match right now.
Right. I've seen figures suggesting it costs, up to 40% more on average to make solar panels, wind turbines, batteries in the U.S. or the EU compared to China. Why is that gap so persistent? And does that massive scale create risks for China itself domestically?
Well, that cost difference isn't just about being more efficient, though that's part of it.
Yeah.
It's really driven by strategic industrial policy, huge state support, and crucially, vertical integration. They control the entire ecosystem, from digging up the raw materials right through to the final assembly. Other countries might focus on just one piece.
Okay.
The domestic risk, though, that's definitely overcapacity. They're basically making more panels and turbines than even their massive domestic market can absorb right now, which creates this pressure to export everything, often at incredibly low prices, sometimes maybe even below cost. And that, of course, leads to trade friction internationally.
Right. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword then. That low cost creates friction with, say, the U.S. and EU who are trying to build their own green industries. But what does it mean for the developing world? For the global south, places that often find the upfront cost of climate action really difficult.
For the global south, it's potentially revolutionary. China's cheap technology dramatically lowers the barrier for everyone else to decarbonize. The sources we looked at called developing economies the decisive battleground for global emissions, and they need affordable solutions, like yesterday. And we're seeing that diffusion happen. Chinese solar panel exports to Africa, for example, were up, 187% in the first half of 2023 alone? This equipment is absolutely vital to help those countries develop without getting locked into dirty, expensive fossil fuel paths for decades.
That creates a really interesting alignment, doesn't it? For years, the thinking was often that industrial growth and cutting emissions were, well, fundamentally at odds, especially for emerging economies. But now China's own industrial interest, being the world's green manufacturer, seems perfectly aligned with the global need to speed up decarbonization.
It really simplifies the climate mitigation equation in a way. If the world is actually serious about hitting any kind of warming targets, it basically just needs the sheer volume and the low cost that China provides right now. That alignment helps avoid future climate costs globally. It supports China's export economy, and it eases that old tension between growth and, environmental protection.
Okay, but this is where we need to inject some nuance, some critical perspective. It's easy to look at that, 887 gigawatts of solar and think, okay, transition done. But if China's already met its Paris goals and has all this capacity, why are they still relying so heavily on coal? Burning so much coal, that seems like a contradiction.
Yeah, that apparent contradiction, it comes down to what some call the transition lag. It's the really important difference between installed capacity and actual generation.
Yeah.
So while the renewable capacity is enormous, it actually surpassed thermal coal capacity earlier this year, I believe. The actual share of electricity produced by wind and solar is still lower than that capacity number suggests. China still leans heavily on coal because, well, their grid system isn't quite flexible enough yet to smoothly handle the ups and downs, the intermittency of all that wind and solar power.
So the grid is sort of struggling to keep up with all the hardware being installed. And that leads us to this problem called curtailment, right? Can you explain what that is? Why would a grid choose to use old, expensive coal power instead of basically free sunshine or wind?
Right, curtailment. It's essentially when available renewable power that could be generated has to be deliberately switched off or blocked from entering the grid.
That sounds incredibly wasteful.
It's a huge waste of clean energy. And the grid prioritizes coal for a few kind of systemic reasons. First, infrastructure bottlenecks. You need massive transmission lines to get power from the sunny, windy, remote areas to the big cities on the coast, and those lines haven't kept pace. Second, the existing rules for dispatching power often guarantee coal plants a certain amount of operating time. They provide grid stability, inertia, and, let's be honest, they're often backed by powerful local interests.
So local governments or maybe regional power companies still want to keep their coal plants running, even if it means throwing away clean electricity that costs billions to build.
And that's often part of the picture, yes. It's a systemic issue tied to existing economic interests and just system inertia. The coal plants were built for stable baseload power, and until China invests massively in battery storage and other forms of flexibility and really reforms its electricity pricing and dispatch rules, they're going to face this challenge of actually using all the clean energy they're building. So the same centralized approach that allowed for that incredible speed in building things is now creating these bottlenecks in integrating it all smoothly.
Okay, so that centralized governance model was great for speed, but it clearly comes with these structural issues and, as you mentioned, geopolitical risks too. Let's unpack the risk side a bit more.
Yeah, the governance paradox is really key here. That central control allows for rapid industrial scale-up, which is good for the climate. But that same concentration creates huge external scrutiny and, frankly, supply chain risks for the rest of the world. We see intense concentration in critical minerals, rare earths, things needed for batteries and wind turbine magnets. That obviously raises dependence concerns for any country trying to switch to EVs and clean grids.
And domestically, you mentioned overcapacity, but didn't that rapid build-out also lead to issues with local government debt? How is all this financed?
That's another layer, yes. A lot of these huge renewable projects and the supporting infrastructure were financed through borrowing by local governments. Sometimes this led to, well, inflated valuations, significant debt tied to land use and infrastructure build-out. So while the projects themselves are green, the financial structures behind them can create local instability and worsen those overcapacity problems.
Right.
And then looking externally, you have to mention the Belt and Road Initiative projects too. We're starting to see debt sustainability challenges emerge in some of those energy projects abroad, where perhaps the development goals weren't always perfectly balanced with hard financial viability.
Okay, so stepping back a bit, despite all these challenges, the grid issues, the ongoing coal use, the debt, the supply chain risks, what gives this whole renewable energy surge its underlying kind of structural resilience, why is it still such a powerful force?
It really comes down to the nature of the technology itself. Once you've built a solar farm or a wind park, it just generates power. It's independent of fuel imports, largely independent of day-to-day political turmoil, unlike fossil fuels where you're constantly vulnerable to global price shocks and geopolitical games.
Local resilience.
Exactly. That structural independence is incredibly valuable in the long run. And look, while many experts think the 1.5 degrees Celsius Paris target is probably, sadly, slipping out of reach, this massive, cheap deployment of renewables is still humanity's best, most powerful tool to at least significantly slow down global warming.
So, thinking ahead, for you listening as you follow this story over the next few years, what are the key things to watch? How do we track how this narrative unfolds, this tension between dependence and diversification?
Well, we need to watch how this new phase of global interdependence plays out. The reality is, the world needs what China is supplying right now. That's pretty much non-negotiable if we're serious about climate action at scale. But the key metrics to monitor aren't just the export numbers anymore. Watch the domestic reforms inside China. Are they really pushing dynamic electricity pricing that favors renewables? Is battery storage deployment accelerating fast enough to actually reduce that curtailment problem?
Okay.
And then crucially, look at the partner countries, the importers. Are they just becoming plug-and-play customers, simply buying and installing Chinese modules? Or are they actively developing their own capabilities across the rest of the value chain, things like project development, system integration, installation, the long-term operation and maintenance services?
Ah, right.
That distinction between just being a customer and becoming a genuine partner with broader industrial capacity, that's really the key to whether countries maintain genuine energy sovereignty in the future.
That difference is critical, isn't it? Being just a customer versus having that deeper capability. It really crystallizes the final thought here. China's industrial power is undeniably forcing the green transition globally, which is necessary. But the world now faces this really stark, defining choice. Do we accept long-term dependency on a single manufacturing giant for the core solution to climate change? Or do we undertake the rapid, probably much more expensive effort to diversify supply chains and manufacturing to maintain more control over our own energy futures?
Indeed. That's the multi-trillion-dollar question for this generation, isn't it?
Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs, and don't forget to like, comment, and share.